Good afternoon to our Lived Black Experience community. We are excited to have you here again with us today as we take a look at another important topic in Black history and in Black recording of history in particular. Today, we'll be talking about archiving Black voices, a discussion of the importance of preserving the stories of Black folk. And this is a very important topic. It's work that we have worked to do through the Live Black Experience project, through the Live Black Experience strategic plan, and it's work that I know our speaker is passionate about as well. So we're going to launch right in to this discussion. I am pleased to present to you Dr. Tara Green, who is the Linda Carlisle Excellence Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Professor and former Director of African American and African Diaspora Studies at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. She is the author of 4 books: A Fatherless Child, Autobiographical Perspectives of African American Men, winner of the 2011 Outstanding Scholarship in Africana Studies Award from the National Council for Black Studies, Reimagining the Middle Passage, Black Resistance in Literature, Television, and Song, and 2 forthcoming books, See Me Naked, Black Women Defining Pleasure During the Interwar Era, and Love, Activism, and the Respectable Life of Alice Dunbar-Nelson. She is also the editor of 2 books, From the Plantation to the Prison, African American Confinement Literature, and Presenting Oprah Winfrey, Her Films and African American Literature. Moving beyond the classroom, she has received recognition for her work as a mentor and for her service in African American studies. Dr. Green is also past president of the Langston Hughes Society and co-editor of Mercer University Press's Voices of the African Diaspora Series. Welcome, Dr. Green.
Thank you so much. When I was a little girl growing up in the suburbs of New Orleans, my mother and uncle would often share with me stories about their youth. My maternal side of the family is from a small rural town called Waterproof, Louisiana, in the northern part of the state. There, they dealt with segregation. It was, of course, the rule of society during their lifetime. From very young ages, my mother and her older siblings picked cotton, as had generations before them. Certainly my grandparents had, their grandparents, and so on. They went to segregated, under-resourced schools in the Jim Crow South, and as one got older, she or he left to settle in New Orleans or in Los Angeles. I am not sure why they told me their stories, their struggles, but I took it all in. I hungered for more. I asked questions to learn more about the details. What I came to realize one day when I was asked why I became an African American literature professor is that my own legacy as an educator was born in those stories. My work as a teacher and researcher relies heavily on excavating the past. One of my joys, which has been disrupted by COVID, is visiting archive collections that hold the stories of Black folks' lives. But thankfully, digitization has closed some gaps that have been produced by travel restrictions and health safety concerns. For example, the respected intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois's work has been digitized. His letters and photos are available through the library website at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Du Bois was someone who wrote daily. He answered letters, he made copies of the letters that he sent, and he kept letters that were received by him. We find there almost a kind of philosophy about how he felt about the world and his place in it, his instructions to other people and advice about how they might respond to other things. In those letters, I also found the voice of his daughter, whom I would later write about in my forthcoming book on defining pleasure, Black women's pleasure. So today I will speak about archival collections that have informed my own work, as I just referenced, and my own intent in working with librarians to archive the voices. I love librarians. The work that they do to archive the voices of Black people for future generations to learn how we lived our lives and how so many live their lives is work that we need to really take seriously for those of us who do not. I begin with Alice Dunbar-Nelson. She's a woman who has lived inside my head rent-free for over 10 years now. She was both an activist and a protester and an organizer. She was also, thankfully, a pack rat who must have realized that her life's work was worth something. Her niece, a librarian, agreed. It was her niece who kept the remnants of her aunt's life, and we now have access to this rich archive, which is housed at the University of Delaware's library. Thanks to a Black woman scholar, before those papers and scrapbooks and letters were purchased by the University of Delaware's library, this Black woman scholar, Akasha Hall, found the collection by visiting Pauline Young. And she is the one, Akasha Hall, Dr. Hall, who made us know about Alice Dunbar-Nelson and her private life. She remembers in an essay that was published in 1980 titled Researching Alice Dunbar-Nelson, a Personal and Literary Perspective, what it was like when she first saw that collection. Quote, "There in the small cottage where she lived was a trove of precious information, manuscript boxes of letters, diaries, journals, scrapbooks on tables, 2 unpublished novels and drafts of published works and file folders, clippings and pictures under beds and bookshelves." Young would later go on to sell most of the collection in that small cottage to the University of Delaware in 1984, where those documents, as I've mentioned, are still housed. That collection is 30 minutes away from where Alice Dunbar-Nelson lived most of her life and built her career in Wilmington, Delaware. Pauline Young, Pauline, who was actually named after Paul Laurence Dunbar, would donate other valuable documents about both she and her aunt to the Atlanta University Center's Robert Woodruff Library, which is a beautiful library, by the way. Alice Dunbar-Nelson was born in New Orleans in 1895. She had published a collection of fiction essays. She was born in New Orleans in 1875. And in 1895, she published a collection of fiction essays and poetry about New Orleans. She was 20 years old at the time. Her work in the accompanying picture caught the attention of the man whom she would marry, the famous, revered Paul Laurence Dunbar. And as I just mentioned, her niece was named for Paul Laurence Dunbar. Their relationship ended formally in 1906 with his death, but we know some of what happened in that relationship because of the letters the two wrote to one another, and that Alice Dunbar-Nelson, Alice Dunbar, took with her when she left her husband 4 years before his death. She began a life anew in Wilmington, Delaware, where she would have an intimate relationship with her principal, Edwina Cruz, and then she married 2 other times. The reason why we know about that intimate relationship is because there are letters from Edwina Cruz to Alice Dunbar-Nelson in that collection. But by the time of her death, she had been a long-time teacher, which she writes about in her in letters and in other documents in that collection as well. She started a hospital by looking at Black newspaper archives that are now digital. We learn about that. She also started several schools. There's documentation about that as well in several places, including newspaper archives. She started an NAACP chapter, and she was head of several organizations, all of which there are documents for in her archives. She was an active and proud member of the suffrage movement and continued strongly in politics, demanding passage of an anti-lynching bill, which still has not been passed in the United States. She is known today as a fiction writer, a columnist, a speaker, and of course, an activist. She died in 1935 from heart problems. But perhaps the most important part of the collection is her diaries, primarily written during the 1920s and the Harlem Renaissance period, which she documents in references in her in those diaries, as well as some of the editorials she wrote during the time. We find her telling her own story in those diaries. So then future readers of her diaries learn how Alice Dunbar-Nelson felt in response to challenges that she faced as an activist, a wife, a daughter, and a supervisor, roles that she managed while caring for family members as well as her own ailments. We also learn about relationships that she had with women and with men, extramarital affairs, and her relationship that was at times trying and challenging with her husband, the instability of their finances, as well as the struggles that she has with her health, which leads to a rather early death. In fact, we hear the creaks and moans of an aging body that gives out only 4 years after her elderly mother passes away. Her ability to write, to capture an audience by telling a story and casting herself as the star of her own dramatic life is ever present in those diaries. And to be sure, each diary serves as the only definitive evidence from her own perspective that she immensely enjoyed intimate relationships with women and with her husbands. And like any sister, she expressed her annoyance of her older sister, who loved and was so devoted to her. But, you know, sometimes they had their little disagreements. But it was her sister who was with her when she died in 1935. We also learn how a Black woman found an escape by leaning into the beauty of nature. One example is given in a description of a drive she took on her way to a National Black Women's Club convention. She wrote, "Miss Violet, Nanny Burroughs, Geneva, and I drove over to Newark in the morning. Maybe it was noon, left Nanny Burroughs at the station, thence through all this beautiful Jersey scenery to Montclair. It seems incredible, all this loveliness. My tired and tortured spirit is soothed by the coolness and green beauty of the hills and trees." Through extensive study of her archival collection, I was able to complete my forthcoming book, Love, Activism, and the Respectable Life of Alice Dunbar-Nelson, and to learn lessons, so many lessons, from this woman who died in 1935. So now I want to move on to oral stories as I began. Technology has made the preservation of voices possible. When interviewers with the Federal Writers Project recorded interviews with the formerly enslaved, they had to go to the people and to their homes to conduct those interviews. I am not opposed to this personal interaction. In fact, I find it quite lovely. But we now have an alternative, a much needed alternative, so that work such as this can continue. Through Zoom, I work with UNC Greensboro's librarians to conduct interviews of people in Greensboro who had participated in protests during the summer of 2020. I saw this as vitally important as history was taking place and unfolding. What was going to happen to what we had in front of us was the question. Would it disappear? Would we remember? Would generations from now know? Would people in other countries understand what we were experiencing here in the United States? Why were people angry? Why were people sad? I had attended a silent demonstration that summer that lasted only about 10 minutes. It lasted long enough for an introduction to be made by the organizers and for us to kneel or stand quietly for a bit over 8 minutes. The amount of time we thought at that time it had taken an officer of the law to kneel in the neck of a Black man named George Floyd as onlookers in Minneapolis begged that man to remove himself from the Black man's neck. Once that video and one of the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery, a Black man in his 20s who was followed and shot as he was merely jogging through a neighborhood in Georgia that looked much like my own. Once those became public, protests erupted near the end of May and lasted much of the summer. Activists demanded police reform and justice for those men and any others who had dealt with the same fate. People cried, discussed systematic racism, and companies began to hire and elevate Black people into high-profile leaderships. Locally here in Greensboro, North Carolina, that's known for the sit-in movement of 1960, Black artists were asked to paint murals on storefronts, but others painted on boarded-up windows. Black Lives Matter was painted on a street downtown in Greensboro, and a number of protests occurred. Some of those protests were organized, but others were impromptu protests that just sort of occurred by disgusted individuals, some of whom were my students. On my campus, students organized a love march that took place Labor Day weekend. As a scholar of African American studies, I could not let this take place without documenting the sincerity of an important moment in American history, one that had ignited movements across the world. What was going to happen to the art, I wondered. In fact, the thought of it just being thrown away made me sick. Who were those artists? I just kept asking myself that. And who were the organizers? The librarians had been having these same discussions as well. When I reached out to them, we met almost immediately and we began to plan. I interviewed the activists and a colleague in the library interviewed the artists. Students in my Black Lives Matter class also conducted interviews. The Triad Black Lives Matter collection is now available for your review and includes interviews as well as photos. Material collections are also available at the library. And of course, not all the interviewees are Black, but they still spoke to a Black experience from their perspective as allies. I learned from them all. I will play a clip of one of my students. Was there a specific incident that occurred?
I have a specific incident of when I was aware of racism to me, but I think when I learned about it initially was through my grandpa. He would often joke about racist incidents that would happen to him. He would say them out of the blue. Oh, I should clarify this. I live with my grandparents all throughout my life. So I'll reference my grandpa and my grandma a lot. My grandma, the only conversations we've had about race have been in the past few years. We never really talked about it. However, my grandpa, the main story I remember is him laughing about a white boy calling him the N-word at a restaurant. And he thought it tickled him so much because, nowadays, like that would happen or that wouldn't happen. And then back then, he had nothing to do other than to just move on. Or he would tell me about places he's been that have had questionable people and then would warn me to not go there. But when I specifically experienced racism, actually has to do with me being a flute performance major. I was the principal flute of the youth orchestra I was in high school. And this was my senior year. I had been in this youth orchestra only 1 year prior. This is my second year. And we were, all the performers entered through the performance door, of course, to get ready. And I had gone through the performance door to figure out where I had to go. There are people who were before me. All of us were dressed the same. The people before me were white people that went up to the lady who was sitting at this chair, designating where people to go. They kind of just went, and I went up to her and I said, do you know where the performer's entrance is? And then she said, well, the spectator entrance is over here. And then I said, well, I'm performing. So, and there was an awkward pause. It was like that awkward, like she kind of like, was like, oh, okay, sorry, performer's board over here. And it wasn't until that moment I like looked at the orchestra completely different. At that time, even other times in music spaces, one thing I always do is count the amount of Black people I see. I can usually do it on one hand, sometimes two, if I'm lucky, out of the 40, 50 people-ish ensemble. And through that, I will always find myself being one of five, one of six, and not really feeling like people could see me the same as everyone else. And I often felt like an outcast a lot of the time, even though I did have a good community, like in the flute studio. Like I felt me and the other flute players are very close. But as it broadened out to the rest of the orchestra, there's more of like a bigger disconnect.
So how did you get involved with playing the flute?
Peer pressure. There's some other kids that were joining band, and I said, I want to have friends in band. So I just signed up for band. I did not have a specific inclination to flute at all. It was just, I tried out a few instruments, and flute was the easiest for me to make a sound out of. I played flute half the sixth grade, then I switched to oboe. Super hard.
So Kyrese goes on to talk about her experience of going out into downtown Greensboro and being involved with the protests, and then later on going to the anniversary of the March on Washington by making her way down up to Washington, D.C. with a couple of friends and listening to the speakers and just trying to get a better understanding of how her experience growing up and trying to process racism, how that experience connected to the deaths that had occurred, looking for community, and just trying to make sense out of what was going on during that time. So we also get a voice not only from someone, a college student in 2020 when that occurred, when that interview occurred, but also the influences of 2 generations before, her loving grandparents that she also references in this interview as well. Black people must tell their stories, our stories. Too often we are silenced. Sometimes we choose silence, and other times we are told to be quiet. Nevertheless, there is power in our voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green. That was a beautiful presentation, and just hearing some of those different stories that were shared is so powerful. Just to launch us right into our Q&A, and I want to remind our audience that if they have questions for you, they can ask those in the chat and we will happily bring them into our conversation here today. But to start us off, Dr. Green, you talked about the connection between your family stories and your sense of a calling to teach and share through your role as a professor. And there was another article that I was reading before this presentation on Hearing Silences by an archivist of the Black experience at Northwestern University Libraries. And in her writing, there's also a reflection on the hidden and sometimes forgotten histories of Black people. In this case, it was particular to San Diego, and her calling, or what she referred to as her calling, to safeguard accounts of African American history and archives. Do you see that as part of your work in sharing and archiving Black stories and history as safeguarding that history, or where does your focus fall in that work?
Well, you know, archivists and people who work in museums are able to do the curation of that work and maybe even ask for donations. Normally, what I have done is once those papers or whatever else is included in those collections, what I've been able to do is to go in and so they've already done that work. The second phase is for me to go in and to try to glean from that a story. And so I've been doing that since my dissertation work, which I started out with looking at the first archive I ever went to was at the Beinecke Library, so that I could get a sense of Richard Wright, because I was writing about his work at the time. And then when I went back to the Beinecke a few years later to do some archival research on A Fatherless Child, I looked again at Richard Wright and I looked at Langston Hughes, because I was specifically trying to figure out what kind of relationships they had with their fathers. But then, of course, I also found out more about the relationship they had with their mothers and the relationship that they had with their grandmothers. And so then I began to understand a little bit more about why they wrote as they did. So how did they present women the way that they did? what motivated them, what inspired them, what were they writing against, what were they writing for. So that work began very early in my career, and it's really, for the most part, being about looking for a story. What is that strand that I can pull from all of this stuff that may be available to us, and that may be scattered in different libraries. So you can find some of Langston Hughes's work not only in the Beinecke at Yale, but also at the Schomburg. And at the Schomburg also, I went there a couple of times because there's an archive there of Malcolm X, whom I also wrote about, and learned a great deal about him that was not available at that time. So that was basically what I was doing initially. But because I understood the importance of being able to go to a library and to have access to those materials, that sparked me when I was just driving down the street of Greensboro and wondering what's going to happen with this art. Because I mean, some of those pieces are so beautiful. And again, people can go to that archive, that collection, and you can just look up Triad, Black Lives Matter collection. You can Google it and it'll take you there to the link. But we have people actually donate photos now. Some of those photos, some of us took from our cell phones. Other photos were taken by people who were a lot more professional. Our own university photographer, in fact, had been taking photos. And then there were some people in the city who are novice photographers who donated work as well. So it's very much a collection of community voices is really what it is. So I'll stop there. I mean, one experience in the work that I was doing as a writer took me back to the orality that started my career in the first place.
Yeah. There seems to be such a strong connection between the both oral and written histories of African Americans and the Black tradition of the griot and the storyteller. How do we connect that legacy of storytelling to the importance of archiving history, whether it's in oral or written histories and archives?
State your question again.
Yeah, I'm just curious how we connect, like you're talking about the work of telling stories, and there's the tradition in the Black community of storytelling. And I'm wondering how we see the parallels or the connection between that history of storytelling and the work of archiving these Black stories and Black history.
Well, the archiving can also include interviews, the oral history interviews. So, and once those are archived, then we can always know something about history from the people that experienced it. So that's one very important perspective. So there still exists now online an archive of people who were enslaved. And so going into the South or wherever people may have been housed at the time, where we hear some of the horrendous experiences that they have. And sometimes they talk about their grandparents and great-grandparents, but there's something about hearing the voice of a person who has experienced something in particular, but something about the voice that really strikes me about those people who were enslaved, because we like to, it helps us with the timeline. So we like to think about, oh, slavery was so long ago, why are we still having that discussion in the United States of America? But listening to the voices of those people who were still alive well after slavery ended in 1865 reminds us that we're not that far along, right? Because there was technology that existed that allowed us to be able to capture those stories. So we cannot forget. That's what the archive does for us, is that it does not allow us to say, oh, well, I don't know anything about that. That's not relevant to me. We can't forget. We cannot forget, because the archive is still there as much as the experience resonates from one generation to the next.
And you know, I find that so important because there's, you know, like you referenced, the recordings of those narratives, and there is such obvious importance of the documents that capture the Black narrative in America, from letters like those of Alice Moore Dunbar-Nelson, the narratives like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, and all of those both written and oral accounts. And when it comes to the written accounts in particular, I find it so interesting that there's also the historical struggle to capture and share those narratives, the extreme levels of work that had to go into publishing works like the autobiography of Frederick Douglass and the narrative A Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. And it also doesn't seem accidental that at the same time as there's this struggle to get these works published, it's coming from or on the cusp of that same era where Blacks in America who were in that state of slavery were hindered from, or it was illegal for them to read and write. So it seems to make us, it's so much more important, the capturing of these narratives and the sharing of them. So I wonder what that tells us about the power of those narratives as well. Why was it so important to keep folks during that period from being able to read and write? And then why was it also made so difficult to share out those stories and those narratives, whether in oral or written form?
Well, you know, one thing that I always remind my students of is that they should read the assigned literature, particularly of that time, because we have to remember that this isn't supposed to exist, that it was illegal for it to exist in many ways, because to be in a space to be free, as Frederick Douglass was when he wrote his 1845 narrative, or Harriet Jacobs says by the end of hers, how disgusted she was with the idea of her freedom being bought. So the act of freeing themselves, at least physically, and Frederick Douglass talks about the intellectual part of how a slave goes from a slave was made a man, then we understand that to be able to do that physically was illegal. But also to be able to write about it was an act of protest itself, because really there was a danger in being able to read and write for that purpose, right? To not be able to sway people, to not be able to write a pass and write and walk out of from enslavement to freedom and so on and so forth. So, and they understood that, you know, something that's quite powerful about Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative is him talking about the importance of literacy, that he understood just by all the man that he was loaned out to when he was in Baltimore, that that to be, and he does something with the N word, but saying to the wife, if you make this, allow this boy to know this end, to know how to read and write, then there will be no keeping him. Mm-hmm. That's what Douglass says happened. Douglas says quite a bit. We don't know if that happened or not, but the fact that he is able to cast himself as a hero of his own life in that narrative says something else about the experience of being able to tell a story as an orator, as he was very well known and respected for, but also as a writer. So these things for some of those people ancestrally was quite important because they connected and they made the narrative longer and more complex for us. That's why we still talk about them. But to just have a voice and to be able to have that voice recorded was just as important as well.
There's a BBC program called Archiving Black America, and in it they focus on James Baldwin's quote, "We are our history," and a recognition that they write that how history is remembered depends on what materials survive and who deems those materials worthy of preserving. And in your presentation, you also focused on the importance of telling our own stories. How do everyday people engage in this important work of capturing, recording, and preserving Black history?
Well, there's a number of ways. There's, we have the internet. So there's certainly blogs and websites that people have set up that are specific about their family and their family history. That's where a lot of work gets done, as people are now taking DNA tests and doing genealogical mappings, because we now have the capability of being able to get into public records. So, and even another project that USC has available also are records that show they call them the slave bills. So who owned whom, basically the receipts of human property in this area, in the state of North Carolina, which have always been available through courthouses and so on and so forth. But now people can go there in North Carolina. And Chapel Hill, I think, has some of those documents also. So many libraries are beginning to do that. That makes it possible for people to be able to, Black people, to be able to find out more about their lineage, but also for white people to find out the connections between their ancestors and the ancestors of Black people. So what do you do with that? And so I think that the family reunions and how people have been, some people have been writing books. Some people, like I said, have been setting up websites. There's also blogging. And I think that any of the social media platforms, podcasts that exist where people might be having conversations with members of families and doing recordings in that way. Another project that we are doing, I just love librarians. I can't say that enough times. If I had known that I could get a library degree, I may have ended up getting one, but I didn't know very much about that when I was coming out of college. But in any case, there's also the work that we are doing to archive Black churches. And so we have one church that's already set up to do that work. And if you're talking about Black churches, of course, you're talking about Black families. And so what becomes really important is that people wanted to work with us in that particular church, that there's somebody who's very active with that church who happened to be a social studies teacher, which means she focused in history when she was a student. So it didn't take very much work convincing, but there are churches that will say, you're not looking at our papers or any of that kind of thing. But the problem with that when organizations say no because of suspicions that we have carried from one generation to the next for a variety of reasons is that people pass away and things get thrown out. And so all of the wonderful work that people may have been doing through their organizations gets lost. And so that's the work that I have been pushing against. I mean, you have no idea how many meetings, emails that I've sent, and then we got cut off with COVID. But I'm going to be knocking on some more doors very soon to go back to people and say, by the way, remember that discussion that we had? Because I just don't want these materials to be thrown away when I know the work that Black women, Black men, Black members of LGBT communities have been doing. That has been really, I mean, like feeding the hungry and just setting up little schools and doing these things that people don't know about. And they should know. We should have access to it.
In one of the articles I was looking at before this session as well, they talked about they called the growing recognition that Western archival science and practice reflect and reinforce a privileging of settler, invader, and colonist voices in it. And he talked about the difficulty in finding marginalized voices in archival collections. Have you seen that same difficulty in some of the research that you're doing? On that question, also, I wonder why Black voices are so limited.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up. You said something about marginalized voices.
Can you hear me now?
It's choppy.
Okay. How about now?
It's still a little choppy, but we'll just try to work through it.
Okay. So I'm just wondering if you have seen the same difficulty in finding records of Black narratives in archival records. And with that, also, why have Black voices been so limited in American archival collections?
Okay, so I think you asked me, have I had the difficulty of finding Black voices in archival collections? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay. For the work that I have been doing, the answer is no, but I know that they exist. So, so when I go to look for records on Black women's organizations, contemporary, I can find 1800s, maybe into the early 1900s, but there's a big gap there. So for any number of reasons. So trying to work with organizations to release some of those documents has been one of my missions in life. But there's certainly a gap. I think probably particularly when it comes to the 20th century and what has been going on locally in communities. So at my university, they recognize that. So I think some of that probably comes from training that is probably occurring in library studies now that was not perhaps occurring in earlier years. And the same just goes for women across the board also. So at my university, it's really easy to find information about men, even though it's a woman's college, and you could not find that much about women, not even white women, until a certain time. So then they have to be very conscious and strategic about saying, oh, well, this is what's happening, so we need to go and get donations in this area, or even look back at what we are doing in terms of how they archive and give the details of and descriptions of what's actually in some of those collections. The way that one archivist put it is that they would find wives buried under husbands, even though those wives had been really important and active in doing things on the campus. So then they have to, how do you make their voices and their presence known, instead of just sort of sticking them under man X. So, so that is certainly an issue, but again, that goes back to the importance of communities' willingness to work with libraries and for libraries to work well and communicate well and be sensitive to the concerns of communities and their organizations and their churches and so on. Okay, I think you're frozen.
Let's see. Are we good
How's
now?
that? Perfect. All right. So, okay, I didn't know if Miss Bernadine had a question, but in your, yeah, let's take this question actually from the audience. So Ms. Deb Harris said, we know that historically founded Black sororities have been doing this work. Can you talk about them?
I'm not sure what she means by this work, but one thing that I will say as a Delta is I believe that our national organization is now working with the Library of Congress and will make some of those materials available, which will be really important. That's something that I read, I think, in a New York Times article or something a few months ago. So, but there are protocols that I think there's been some concern about what to make available to the public. So yeah, so she says community service work. So in terms of archiving that and making it public, organizations tend to have to follow guidelines from their national organizations to see what to make available and what not to make available. So, but again, Black newspapers are always there recording things. So if somebody has some sort of community service event or, you know, some awards event or something like that, then that's one of the best places to be able to track what has happened in the community is through those databases and whatever archives they have set up. But sometimes those are dated as well. So we might not be able to find an article that was written last year. So also, I know that libraries are trying to work with local Black newspapers to get whatever they have archived also.
In your interview with Kyrese, as she shared her story, there was that beautiful sense of her finding herself and establishing her place in her world, whether it was through music or activism or the different things that she was involved in. And there seems to be such a strong sense of historical records as legacy making and identity forming. Do you see that as the importance of archiving Black voices, that work of not only finding each individual's voice and identity and legacy, but also in shaping those legacies for the broader Black community?
Well, it can be. It depends on the interviewee, and it also depends on the questions that are being asked. I did not ask anybody any questions about their identity. So, but it may have come up in their own journey. It may have been connected to how they processed racism. So it really depends on the interviewee. It depends on the purpose of the interview.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Green. I know we were working to keep this at the hour mark, and I think we've done it. So, but really, I want to thank you for sharing your narrative, sharing the work that you're doing, and sharing with us the importance of capturing Black voices and history, and ensuring that it remains as part of the record. It's such important work, and it's work that is so often not seen in broader conversations that we have. We also want to say thank you to our audience for joining us. We are always grateful for your engagement and for participating in these conversations and helping us to do the work of recording this story for the Flagstaff Lived Black Experience, the Arizona Lived Black Experience, and as we continue diving into different topics, the broader American Black experience story. We have coming up for you in the coming days on Wednesday, May 5th, a session on how Mary Jane got her name. In the wake of to legalize cannabis in the United States, a movement for social equity within the industry has emerged. This session will provide an in-depth review of the history of cannabis and ideas as to what social equity means and looks like for communities of color who have been impacted by the prior criminalization of it. That session is coming up on Wednesday, May 5th at 6 p.m. Arizona Mountain Standard Time. The Live Black Experience is dedicated to fully engaging the community in all aspects of the Live Black experience and facilitating community dialogues regarding it that lead to mutual understanding, respect, and reconciliation. We are housed in the historic Murdoch Community Center, which is located on the site of the old Dunbar Elementary School. Dunbar was desegregated almost 2 years prior to Brown versus the Board of Education, and the school system here was held up by the NAACP nationally as a model for education. By taking a few minutes to complete the survey linked on your screen, and that will be shared in the comments, you are helping us to continue to provide the community with relevant and timely programming. And finally, if you enjoy the programming brought to you by the Murdoch Community Center, we ask you to consider helping us to continue that work with a monetary donation. You can do so by going to the link on your screen, scanning the QR code, or following the link that will be in the comments. And as a reminder, the Southside Community Association is a nonprofit 501c3 organization, and we thank you in advance for any donations that you're able to make. And in closing, we again say thank you to our community. Thank you, Dr. Green, for joining us today and for hosting this series for us. It's been wonderful conversing with you and learning from you in the series that you presented with us, and we hope to see you back with us again soon. To the broader community, we say again, thank you for joining us. And as always, we hope that you will be blessed and be well. Thank you.